I'm sure there's some problems with Hebrew translation into English that complicates things as well, so we'll kind of do our best with those. But starting back in chapter 20, some people will say it's chapter 20, verse 22 through the end of 23 is called the Book of the Covenant. I think I see why they're doing that, because I guess the Ten Commandments were kind of separately given to Moses, but I see the Ten Commandments as part of the Book of Covenant as well. So I'm including them. Some people might disagree with that division, but I think it's helpful. And what you need to know is that God is going to add more laws to this later, right? This is just kind of the foundation point here. They're not separate and disconnected from the Ten Commandments, which is why I kind of don't really like to separate them in my delineation there. But rather, the Ten Commandments offer general moral principles under which all the specific laws to come will build off of. And because these laws can be hard to navigate and keep track of, I've divided them up, and I'll show you those divisions here in a moment. But before we do, let's go to God in prayer. Father in heaven, we praise your name. Thank you so much for Jesus, for showing us that amazing loyal love to people so undeserving of it. We pray, Father, that anything that we do for you religiously will be an act of gratitude for your grace and not an act of trying to earn your love and earn worthiness for heaven, to recognize that Jesus is our only path there. Thank you so much for that grace and mercy. Be with us as we study this morning. Help us to be careful not to read our modern notions back into the text this morning, but to allow the text and its ancient culture to inform us about who you are and what you want from your people. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So I divided these two chapters. I didn't get into Dwayne's chapter in chapter 23, which he'll cover. But in just these two chapters, there's basically 18 categories of laws there, and I think it's just helpful to get a big picture look at the kinds of things that God was concerned about most for his people. So everything that we're going to look at today in these two chapters will fall under one of those categories. And I just want to make some big picture points about these laws. I'll make 7 points. That's the holy number. So now, first of all, these laws were made and designed for agrarian life, for a culture of farming, right? And agriculture and crops and vineyards in the land of Canaan, where they were headed. And so you'll have language about people needing to keep their animals under control, right? Don't let your ox go around goring other people, right? Or goring other people's animals. And don't let a fire break out and burn other people's vineyards and crops. Okay, these are all laws anticipating their future life in the promised land. And that'll become even more clear in chapter 23, where he mentions, the conquest of Canaan. Number 2, God is establishing a theocracy here for his people. So in our day, we separate religious and civil matters, and we bring legal disputes to non-Christian governing officials. In that day, though, all civil matters were religious matters and were to be brought before godly judges, kings, and priests who would rule on those cases on God's behalf. The law of Moses, then, was actually the law of the land. So you couldn't distinguish those two. If you violated the law of Moses, you were not only sinning against God, you were disobeying the government as well, because God was the government. God's law was the governmental law. Thirdly, it was a brilliantly high standard. It was brilliant in the sense of being genius, okay, for its day, but it was also very high standard compared to other law codes written back at that time. In Deuteronomy 4, which Dwayne had us read, in verse 8, Moses says, what nation is there that has a law so righteous as the judgments and statutes that you've given us? I mean, he just recognized, there's nobody on the earth who has a more genius and more holy standard of living, okay, than we do as Israelites. Number 4, this was written to former slaves in Egypt. What happens is people come to these chapters and they start reading about slaves and they freak out and, God, he promotes slavery, right? And we're going to have that conversation this morning. We'll talk more about that. But before we start accusing God, okay, of being cruel for owning slaves, God makes it a very clear goal of his to differentiate the Israelites from Pharaoh in Egypt. to make sure that they never treat one of their slaves the way Pharaoh treated them while they were in Egypt. In fact, later in chapter 22, in verse 21, he says, "You shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt." So their mistreatment in Egypt by Pharaoh and their kind treatment by God becomes the basis for their motivation on how they treat other people and why they should be kind to other people because of the kindness God showed them in Egypt and the cruelty that Pharaoh showed them in Egypt. And this is why the book of Exodus is so foundational to the rest of the history of the Old Testament, because later what's going to happen, the Israelites are going to start treating their neighbors terribly. They're going to start oppressing the poor. Okay, they're going to mistreat their slaves. Why? Because they forgot who they are. They forgot where they came from. They came from slavery in Egypt. And if you keep that perspective in mind, I was a slave, I was a nobody, I was mistreated, then when you come out the other side of that, then you're going to be determined, okay, I'm not going to mistreat other people. I'm not going to treat people like Pharaoh treated me. This is also interesting. There's no prison system, okay, under this old law of Moses. It seemed like there were just major crimes and minor crimes. And if you committed a major crime, you were put to death. And if you committed a minor crime, well, then you had to make restitution for it to the victim. Now, some advantages, okay, to that kind of system. I'm not necessarily, promoting this in today's world, but there are some interesting advantages to think about. Number one, it makes sure that the victims are compensated. I mean, today, like if somebody steals your stuff and they go to prison for it, the courts force them to make restitution, but it's kind of hard to get your money when the person is in prison, right? So I don't know how hard it is in some cases to actually see that money. But instead, back then, the thief was obligated to go and pay that victim back. And if they couldn't make that payment, then they'd sell themselves into slavery in order to pay that debt off. Secondly, it required the offender to go look the victim in the eye. And I think that's very difficult. Okay, it humanizes the victim, and it's more likely to lead to the offender being repentant. Okay, I understand they could still be psychopaths or whatever, but most of the time you go and you look your victim in the eye. That's really a powerful thing. And if the offender is repentant under that kind of system, well, then it gives him or her a chance to start over with a new life after they make restitution. After they make things right, okay, we'll go on, sin no more, right? And live a different life, live a better life. Another advantage is that for those who committed major crimes, it prevents the rest of the nation from having to support you for the rest of your life as you spend life in prison. You're just dead. And some people see that as harsh, okay, but the last advantage here is that the death penalty, that's a pretty serious deterrent for crime. Okay? I mean, some people, prison is worth it to them. I'll commit this crime, I'll go to prison, and maybe it's not that bad, my friends are there, and 3 meals a day, right, get a cot, 3 hots in a cot. They say, okay, but are you going to commit this crime knowing that you're going to be killed for it? That's a much bigger cost. You have to think about that, okay, a lot more before proceeding. Number 6, judges would use these laws and extrapolate from the principle of these laws and apply them to other cases. Okay, so a law might mention someone stealing an ox. Okay, but judges would not say, well, that only applies to an ox. But if you steal someone's clothes, well, we don't have a law for that. It only says an ox. No, they're going to take they're going to use wisdom. They're going to take the principles of theft and the value, assessing the value of what was stolen and restitution and all that, and apply it to other cases. And then finally, all these laws are rooted in the character of God. Sometimes people accuse the old law of being barbaric, but it was not at all. It came from God's very nature. And if we are thinking of His laws as barbaric, it's just because we don't understand the point of that law. And we don't appreciate the ancient culture and how things were just different back then. And we look at them as barbaric, when no, it's just a different way to live. And we have our own problems, and they had theirs, and that's just the way it goes. So let me ask this question. What do these laws teach us about God's character and nature? What do these laws teach us about God's nature and character? And if you had any question or comment about those 7 things that I listed here, you can ask about that or comment about that if you want as well. But what do you think? Raise your hand. We'll get you a microphone so people can hear your comments. Yeah, Phil?
Yeah. I go back to chapter 20, when God's revealing himself to them on the mountain, and they're so overwhelmed by his presence, they cannot deal with him one-on-one. So they ask for a proxy relationship. God is saying, no, I want this with you. And this is the kind of relationship I want with you because I'm this kind of person. In the garden, when man had the presence of God before sin, he acted a certain way. He was obedient. After sin in the garden, man looked at God differently because of his sin. Mm-hmm. He hid from God rather than approach God.
Sure.
He was hiding. And then when he realized what he had done against God, inherently he knew he was wrong. He tried to cover himself with his own covering. And God said, no, I'm here and I'm still your God, even after sin. I may have given you a curse. I may have given you a hardship, but I did so because of the curse of sin.
Yeah.
Now what I'm doing is the same thing with the Israelites. I brought you out of slavery, spiritual slavery as it were, and now I'm bringing you back into my presence, and I'm going to remind you of what you forgot before sin, that this is who I am.
Okay. Yeah. Mike?
I would say and the victim's rights.
Okay, yeah.
And it didn't matter where you were in society. It's
Good.
across all levels.
Yeah, good. So God values human life and justice, and it's interesting what you bring up there because that was unique. It was regardless of class or gender. There were other law codes like the Code of Hammurabi that was a Babylonian law code from the 1700s, a few hundred years before the law of Moses. And people try to say, well, Moses just copied off of Hammurabi or whatever. No, this law is so much higher. And one of the reasons is because in Hammurabi's code, it would give different penalties based on your social class and status. God doesn't do that. Shows no partiality. It doesn't matter who you are. God takes your life seriously and your property seriously. Later he talks about a pregnant woman getting harmed accidentally in a fight. I mean, if her baby dies, God takes that seriously. The offender is going to be put to death for that. And that's life in the womb that God is taking very seriously and requiring life for life. All right, what else? Anybody else? Mary, sorry.
Well, that was my point, his
Sorry, I do
total
that every
lack
time.
of partiality. When even today, I mean, not just in the ancient world, but even today, you can go to countries where people have less of a legal standing because of who they are.
Yes.
And there are countries where women can't witness against a man, or a person of one religion can't witness against another. We see that even today, but God doesn't hold with that.
Yes. Yeah, one of the things he condemns Israel for later is partiality by judges. They're accepting bribes. They're saying, oh, you're rich. Okay, I'll get you off the hook. God says, I see all that, and that is an abomination to me.
And then the other part of that is that he values the most vulnerable people, the poor and
Yes.
widows and orphans.
Absolutely. He has great care for those who are in need, who can't take care of themselves. Really good. Yeah, Joe?
Yes, it sort of harkens back to the previous study in grace. He cares for these people. All that he's doing is not for him, it's for them, so they can know his nature and how they should act. And so the law is not to condemn, the law is to help them.
Yeah.
And so, care for his creation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Will?
This is a question after this one. What seems to be the case as well is just how efficient these rules are, the methods he's using to enforce the discipline and the love. And now my question, what's a theocracy?
Oh yeah, theocracy just means that God is the head of the government. His law is the law of the land. So like us, today we don't live in a theocracy because, the U.S. Constitution is our law and we have a lot of laws on the books that police officers enforce, but police officers are not enforcing God's laws in our country. But back then, I don't think they had police officers like we do, but if they had police officers, they would be enforcing the law of Moses. Their police officers were the religious leaders, right? The Pharisees are busting everybody for not being as righteous as they were, Yeah, good question. Those are all really good. I see some other things. God, he values the sanctity of marriage. He is not okay with sexual immorality, with fornication, sex outside of marriage, sex before marriage, sex with animals. He mentions that. He's like, any aberration from the male-female design of marriage is is not acceptable to the Lord. He's serious about our worship to him. He's got laws here about idolatry, not tolerating you worshiping false gods. Because which one of those gods that you're worshiping rescued you from Egypt? None of them, because they don't exist, okay? But I'm the one that deserves your worship for what I've done for you. Okay. Oh, here's another good one. God cares about the motivations of our hearts. There's nuance in God's law. So for instance, he distinguishes between murder and manslaughter. Other law codes of the day, it was just kind of like, you take someone's life, that's it. You're done. They didn't really appreciate the nuance of what was going on in your heart, whether there was premeditation or whether it was accidental. God actually takes that into account. Somebody else have a microphone back there? Okay. No, I didn't know if somebody had a comment. Okay. All right, so let's have this conversation next, okay? Do you see, if we're just looking at these texts, okay, in Exodus 21 especially, that's really where all these slave laws are, do you see any differences between these slave laws in the way that we treated slaves in America? Because I think what happens is we bring all of the baggage from the horror of slavery in America and we import those into the text, and the text is just, it's totally foreign to that kind of slavery. So what do you see in the text that gives you some clues as to why this slavery is so much different than what was practiced in America? Because this is one of the main charges against Christianity today. That's why it's important to talk about, because critics of Christianity will say, oh, God just supported slavery. Well, when they say that, what does everyone think? We think about slavery in America and we're like, that's horrible. How could God support that? And yeah, that's a good question. God didn't support that, but people try to make the Bible out to sound like it did. So let's talk about it. Mary and Randy?
A slave was not property. They owed loyalty and service to their master, but they had legal protections from being beaten to death. Mm-hmm. We all know there were stories from Southern slavery about slaves being beaten to death, and nobody cared because they were property.
Absolutely.
And then also what I noticed was female slaves, they could be, treated like concubines. They could be sold to anyone. Here, you can't sell a female slave to a foreign nation.
Right.
Or if you do sell her, you have to make provisions. I think in America you could sell a slave to anyone because there was a great fear of being sold down the river.
Yeah. Yeah, those are good. Yeah, those are great distinctions. He'll say, if you beat a slave and you knock out a slave's tooth, that slave's free to go, right? You're not going to be beating on your slave. God was very much against violence there. And then, there were some legal protections for female slaves. Randy?
A lot of cases it was more the indentured servant aspect. And as you mentioned earlier, it was a way for people to make things right. It was a way to help people out who just had no other way to get out of debt, you might say. So it was a much more positive kind of a thing. And whereas the slavery we had earlier in this country was a profiteer kind of, just like the sweatshops in some of these third world countries, a way to make a product at a bigger profit, and who cares about the people? This showed a lot of care.
Yes, it was much more of an employer-employee relationship. It was like, I need to go make money, so I go work for a head of a household. And I say, hey, I'm gonna live with you. That head of the household will make an agreement to pay you a certain amount, to give you food, to give you clothing, sometimes shelter. You could live with them there on their property, and that was a benefit for you. That's how you made money in that society. And before I say something else that will tread on someone else's comment, I'll wait till the microphone. Oh, Terry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing that Randy said, but there's also some benefits. There's more benefits to indentured servitude. When this country was founded, a lot of people came here as indentured servants, not slaves, and their passage was paid here in I guess a quid pro quo relationship. Their passage would be paid by their labor when they got here, and it seems like God has just worked out the terms of that indenturement beforehand, before so when a person does find themselves in debt, they know what the terms of that indenturement will be throughout the term. And after 7 years, hey, you're free. You've worked off your debt, you're done.
Yeah.
And then the same thing goes, if, at the end of the 7 years, if a person finds that he's profited well, working for this person and they want to stay there, there's also a mutually beneficial relationship. A lot of people think that he can just go to the slave owner and say, hey, I want to stay here. But there's also a conscious decision by the slave owner saying, yes, I will pierce your ear, So if that was a worthless slave, then yeah, he's not going to stay most likely.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
So everything here is voluntary.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah. Everything's voluntary. And I'll add to that. Verse 16, kidnapping is forbidden.
Exactly.
The entire slave industry in America was built on kidnapping, right? People against their will. But like you're saying, it was voluntary.
Yeah. The kidnapping part, I kind of disagree with you on, the slave trade. I believe that it was wrong, but it's not that these slave traders went to different countries and they forced people into slavery. They just went and bought people that were already slaves.
Yeah, well, I think they were kidnapped by other people.
Correct.
By other people.
Yeah,
My
yeah.
point is, yeah, sure.
Kidnapped
Kidnapped originally, okay?
Yeah, or they could have been born into it.
Yeah, exactly.
That sort of thing. So.
Sure. Yeah, really good. It's totally different from what we see here. And yeah, some slaves, they would love their master so much that at the end of their contract, they'd say, I'm staying here forever. I mean, that's not going to happen if it's a horrendous situation like it was in America. Okay, does somebody else have one? Okay. Let's see. Let me make sure I didn't. Sexual immorality is forbidden. Okay, there was so much, just sexual violence towards slaves in our country. This slavery is not rooted in race because these are Hebrew slaves who are owning Hebrew slaves. Okay, so it's not a racism thing like it was in our country. The slaves here had a limited contract. They're not held captive their whole lives. And in fact, in Deuteronomy 15, it says when the end of that contract is up, you send your slave away with all that he needs to go and start a new life, essentially. And it is interesting. Sometimes the English translation, the Bible will use the term ownership or property regarding slaves. But when we hear that again, we immediately think, oh, they're treating them like they're subhuman. But again, that's not what God means. It's kind of the sense in which you volunteer for the military, and now you are the military's property, right? It's not that they don't value you. It's just that you have voluntarily said, I belong to you guys. You get to tell me where to go and what to do. Okay, and that's the same sense here. It's not some cold-hearted, evil master giving orders to someone subhuman in his eyes. No, remember, this was written to former slaves. So they would have that proper perspective to understand how to treat slaves well. When someone became an employee, right, they're volunteering to work for the head of the household and then to go live there with the family until the contract is up. And this was think about it like this. This was kind of like Jacob going to work for Laban. And he works there for Laban, right, for about 7 years, right? I mean, more because he wants, he got tricked in the marriage deal and all that stuff. Okay, but at the end of the contractual arrangement with Laban, Jacob went out with all these amazing blessings. He got daughters of Laban, he got livestock, right? He got all these things from Laban. So again, I know the word slave, as soon as we hear it, we're just like, terrible. And it is terrible when we're thinking of it in our context, but we got to try to set that baggage aside and just see it for what it was in its original ancient culture here in Exodus. All right, okay, any comments or questions about anything that we've said so far? And then we'll actually get into some of these slave laws. All right, Phil and then Carol.
Yeah, you keep mentioning that they were previous slaves.
Yeah.
It's ironic that they were slaves for 400 years, but God has to make laws to teach them not to treat each other like slaves.
I know.
It doesn't make sense
sad.
to me.
Right.
If they've been set free from that mentality of being a slave, why would he have to make all these laws about slavery and not do that? Yeah. Why would it was so ingrained in them that you would think that because they were treated like slaves for so long, that when they be set free from that with God, that they would never want to treat their neighbor that way, never act in that way. But it was so hard to break that mindset. And sin is what does that to us. Sin enslaves us to unrighteousness and causes us to treat our neighbor unneighborly.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, that's really good. I was thinking, it says in Proverbs 30, verse 21 to 23, that one of the things that the earth quakes under and can't bear up under is when a slave who becomes king. Because that's the thing, once the slave who used to be powerless and who used to be dominated over becomes the one in power, sometimes that can go really bad. Sometimes the slave, that power can go to his head. I'm the master now. Now I have a slave. Now I'm going to be the one giving orders. And then because of our evil hearts, God has to give those rules and regulations. Carol?
This slavery was also a way for people to rise in their social class.
Okay.
If you were poor and you couldn't feed your child, you could often sell them into slavery so that you knew that they had 3 meals a day, a roof over their head, and a wage.
Absolutely.
And also, fathers could find their daughters a husband or a master who would support them and bring them up in the world and social status.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, yeah, because we'll read about in the text like a father selling his daughter, and we're like, "What are you talking about? Like, is this human trafficking? Like, they're going to go into she's going to like be trapped in the porn industry or something?" Like, no, that's not what it's talking about. It's talking about how he's giving all the marriages were arranged back then, right? So it's the idea that the husband, right, is going to pay a bride price for her, and that was paid to the father. So when the father sold his daughter in marriage, he's just taking a bride price for her and then setting her up for a great life, right, with this man who's going to treat her well. Like the father had the choice. He wasn't just going to sell her to some deadbeat guy, right? The father actually had discretion on who he could give his daughter's hand in marriage to. And so if he sells her to a guy, it's because he has confidence this is a guy who's going to love her and take care of her for the rest of her life and set her up well. So again, those are other category errors that we make in our minds. We just have to break through it. It's so hard because I still do it. I still read it. I'm like, sold someone? What? And it doesn't mean the same thing. Okay, Randy.
I forgot now.
What? Okay, sorry. I do that. I talk so much, people forget what they were thinking. All right. Well, let's. Oh, go ahead, Joe. I didn't see
Oh,
you.
yeah,
Yep.
that's fine. Why did they have to? Phil has a good question. Why is it they had to do that? Well, before this, they had always wanted to go back to Egypt. You're trying to kill us. Why are you trying to kill us out here? I always want to go back to Egypt. And I think another thing is, in 2 Peter, it talks about a dog returns to its own vomit, and that's a lesson we can learn today. The things that snare us, we need to break free of it and keep and try not to go back to it over and over and think about it and ponder and rationalize and stuff like that, because that's what they're doing. And, it speaks to us today.
Yeah. Good thoughts. Okay, well, let's get into some of the language, because I just think Exodus 21 just has some really hard language. I think part of it is because of the Hebrew to English translation is a little bit difficult, but it's also difficult because we just don't understand their system back then and how it worked. So let's talk about some of these slave laws specifically in 1 to 11 and then 20, 21, and 26 to 27. So basically here in verses 1 through 6, it's an idea of, hey, an Israelite, if he has more work around his house than can be done by his own family, well, then he could buy a slave. He could buy somebody to be an employee and pay them under this contract. I'm going to agree to food and housing and clothing and shelter and all that. And if you were a single man, or if you had a family, at the end of that 6 years, right, in the 7th year, you could go free. Like, you just take your family with you. Or if you didn't have a family and you were single, you just go free. Or, obviously, if the arrangement is great, you can make another contract, or you could say, I'm going to stay with you forever. And then they would have that ear-piercing ceremony, which I'll talk about in a second. The trick is, though, and this is where the language is a little odd, if the master gives you a wife from another one of his employees, right, another one of the female employees or slaves, then if your contract is up before hers, well, then you can't just take her with you at the end of your contract because she's still working. Like she still has an obligation there. And especially if they have children together, like those kids are also going to be beneficial for the master. And so you can't just take them with you if they still have time left on our contract. So presumably you would either have to wait until her contract is up before leaving. You can make a new 6-year contract to stay longer. Or again, you could say, wow, this master is so great that actually he's providing a wonderful life for our family. And so I think we should all just stay with him. And I'm going to agree then to be your slave forever. And they would have a ceremony where he would take an awl, which is like a sharp pointed stick for poking holes in leather and wood. And the master would pierce the servant's ear. And that would be the sign that you belong to your master forever. We actually sing a song here, "Pierce my ear, O Lord my God," right? And that's like a really weird song if you don't know the background, okay? Okay, but that background is coming from this text because we're saying, because the Bible, this is the other thing that bothers people. It's why people, hate Christianity. One of the reasons, because the Bible also calls Christians slaves. We're all bond slaves of God. We're all his servants. But the thing is, slavery is not a bad gig at all if you have the most benevolent master in the world who loves you and does everything he can to take care of you and will sacrifice his own son to save you. I mean, that is like, yes, that's the ultimate beneficial situation if I can be a slave of God. And so, yeah, pierce my ear, Lord. Absolutely. I'm staying with you forever because you're the best master. Now, I also see such wisdom in this ceremony had to be performed in front of a panel, of judges, right? This was a very public thing. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that, right? Because it would prevent the owner of the house from sneaking up behind the slave with like a hole puncher and just, clipping him and then running away. Because then the slave's like, wait a second, I didn't sign up for this. But it would need to be witnessed, okay, that this slave was agreeing to it, the owner was agreeing to it, the master was agreeing to it, and it was a mutually beneficial thing. And then when we get to verses 7 through 11, again, this one just freaks us out because it just makes us cringe or to hear about a father selling his daughter as a slave. But remember, she's just going to work as someone's employee, like Carol pointed out, to support her family, her household. This is not human trafficking at all. And then again, what I think is happening here, and this seems to be the way that the Jews understood this passage as well, is in this section from 7 to 11, the father is giving his daughter as an employee with the understanding that at the end of her contract, she will marry the master or marry the master's son. Okay, it's kind of like Jacob, right? He's like, okay, I'm going to work for you, Laban, for 7 years, and then when my contract is up, well, then I'm going to marry your daughter. I'm going to marry into your family. And in that sort of situation, couldn't you see how the Jews, the masters might think, oh, well, she's just a second-class wife because she was just a slave, and now she's my wife, and so what God's doing here is saying, no, you have to treat her like a full wife, right? You're not going to treat her like she's a wife who's less than any other wife just because she was your servant or your slave. And he sets up 3 different scenarios. The first scenario is if the master decides he doesn't want her as his wife anymore, and he reneges on the agreement. It's actually presented as a negative thing that in verse 8 at the end, this is unfair by the master. If he, after her contract is up, says, I don't want, I know we agreed to this, but I'm not marrying her. Well, that's an unfairness by the master. And he cannot go and then just sell her to some foreign nation or something. I mean, that's crazy. That's ripping her out of her homeland. He says what needs to happen is the father can buy her back. He can return the bride price to her father, and she'll go be back home with her own people. So again, you're going to treat this woman well. There's a lot of women's rights in the law of Moses that were completely foreign to other law codes. They did not recognize the value of women the way God's law did. And that's one of the distinctions there. Also, the second scenario is if instead of marrying him, the master says, well, you can marry my son, well, he says, okay, that's fine, but just make sure you still treat her with all the dignity of a daughter of Israel. And then thirdly, if a master decides to take another wife for himself, other than her, he cannot ignore her needs. He cannot say, well, she's just a second-class wife, so I'll focus on this other wife over here. He says, no, you cannot neglect her. If you neglect her, if you don't give her food and clothing and even, sex and marriage, like, she can go free. She's done with you. She can go back home to her father. So all this sounds crazy to us, I know, but these laws were actually meant to protect the dignity of women despite the less than ideal circumstances like polygamy, which God allowed but was not advocating for at all. And then verses 20 and 21 are classic things that people bring up against God's law here, because God did allow masters to punish their slaves for wrongdoing. Sometimes a slave would steal your stuff, right? Sometimes they'd refuse to work. Sometimes they'd, commit sexual immorality with your family members. I mean, they were open to being punished, for their disobedience, but God says there's got to be limits. There's got to be limits on that. You're not going to be Pharaoh. You're not going to be harsh, beating your slaves. We already talked about 26 and 27, putting out a slave's eye or tooth, the slave could go free. And verse 21 is the classic verse that is just it's hard to understand in English because it makes it sound like, okay, if you beat your slave and he dies, well then you're put to death. If you beat your slave and he's alive for 2 or 3 days, but then dies at the end of 3 days, well then you're fine. Then you don't have to die. That doesn't make any sense, at all in context, but that's how it sounds in English. Okay, but really, in the context, what it's saying is, if you beat that slave, and the slave is laid up for 2 or 3 days in bed, and then he survives and he's fine, well then, the punishment that you incur as the master are the 2 or 3 days worth of work that you lost. Okay, so you still deserve punishment as the master, but you're not going to be killed for it because your slave lived. You already lost money because the slave was out of work for 2 or 3 days. Okay? So it's clear God is not condoning masters beating their slaves, even as punishment for wrongdoing. Then you have theft laws, which are really interesting. God, He's always wise to make sure that the punishments fit the crime, right? So in Exodus 22 and verse 1, there's a higher restitution for a stolen ox than there is for a stolen sheep. And that's because oxen were used for labor and work. So if someone steals your ox, you're losing a lot of money. Okay, someone steals a sheep, it's not as big a deal. You're going to use those for sacrifices and maybe food or whatever, but the ox is more important, and so the price is higher. And then I find it really interesting. God allowed homeowners to use lethal force to defend themselves against a burglary, but only if it happened at night. If the burglary happened during the day, you couldn't kill the thief. Otherwise, you'd be killed. Okay, but if it happened at night, you could absolutely kill the thief in self-defense. Well, why? Well, probably because at night, it's a lot harder to assess the situation properly. Who is this person? Does he have a weapon? I can't see anything, right? They must have ill intentions, because if they had business with me that was good, they would come during the day, right? They wouldn't be in my house at night. And of course, at night, if the owner was awakened from his sleep, by the thief, it's harder to control your response, right? You're just going to be freaked out. Your adrenaline's going to be pumping, and you're going to be doing whatever you have to do to protect your family. But during the day, it's a different situation, because you can see exactly who this person is, what sort of weapons or anything in their hands, You're in complete control of your faculties. You can call for help, because there's going to be other people around you that are awake, right, that can come to your aid. God's not saying they couldn't defend themselves against the thief. He's saying you can't kill them if it's daytime. Okay? And then that thief, if he didn't steal anything at all, he still needs to pay restitution, right, for breaking into your house that didn't belong to you. And if he can't afford to make restitution, well, he'd have to sell himself into a slave and work that debt off over that 6-year contract. I also find it interesting that God, He always takes into account the harm done. Okay? He doesn't just say, well, it was a crime, that's it. They're all the same. It's like, no, he takes the harm done into account. So, for instance, if the thief got away and he stole your stuff and he was caught with your animals, but the animals were still alive, that was a big deal, but it wasn't as big a deal as if the thief had killed those animals or sold those animals to someone else. Why? Because, well, now the thief can just give your animals back. So the thief would then owe you double. But if he sold your animals or killed your animals, he'd owe you 4 or 5 times as much. So God's taking into account the harm that is done. Okay. All right. So let me ask these final questions. Even though we're not under the law of Moses today, what value can these laws have in our lives today? I know we'll probably never, have a theocracy in our country. I get that. But are there any sort of things that these can teach us about what value we can have as a society living here. All right, Mary?
I think
Randy?
it overlays the question in the beginning is we know God hasn't changed, and He made these laws for His people at one time for the good of the people.
Yeah.
So I mean, we can take them spiritually, we can take them psychologically. If we're an employer, of course, these would be useful for treating our employees
Good.
fairly.
Yeah.
There's always ways we can apply them without saying, oh yeah, we ought to have a death penalty for
Right.
for theft or
Right.
something like that. But they express God's nature, which hasn't changed.
Yeah. Yeah, those are really good thoughts, Randy.
Yeah, and the founders, after they wrote the Constitution, there's one of them is quoted as saying, "The hand of God was with us." So we're benefiting from that as well, because it came through our, God-fearing men who wrote our Constitution. And I also remembered what I was going to say earlier, if I could do that.
Okay.
I wanted to say something about what Phil said earlier about how they were slaves for all those years and still had to be given laws to how to treat slaves. It made me think. It seems like, and it appears to me that from the days of Noah, God's plan to save mankind included a plan to work on the hearts and to create a people with a good heart. And it took a long time because that society back then just was not a people with hearts.
Yeah.
Like
Exactly.
you mentioned with the laws of the Hammurabi and others, it just didn't have the heart in there.
Right. And that's what Jesus came to show, is that you guys don't get that the law of Moses was not just these rigid rules. They're to teach you about the heart of God. And now I'm here to show you what the heart of God really looks like. Okay, for time's sake, let me just answer this real quick. Some things I have: wisdom in having judges, neutral third parties to rule in cases. It helps us see you can't treat every case the same. There are nuances, right? I've heard Christians say, well, somebody breaks into my house, I'll blow them away. And that's it. And it's like, okay, but I think we need to be very careful about that and value human life, okay, that the way God does. And we also need to make sure that the punishment fits the crime in our society. I think societies have always struggled with this. Our society, too, without getting too political, okay, sometimes get things backwards. And we are passing minor sentences on major crimes in our culture. And then we're passing major sentences on minor crimes in our culture. And we're just missing, the differences between those two. Okay, here is the question. Because we can't cover every one of these laws in class, was there any particular law in these two chapters that you had a question about, the meaning on, want some more clarity about? Okay, Will's got one.
It's really quick.
Sure.
Lethal force. Is that like killing them?
Yes. Yep, absolutely. All right, Brandon's got one.
I might have missed you explaining this a little bit more, but if a wife is sold and not taken as a wife at the end of the term,
Yes.
you said that she can be bought back by the father. If the father is no longer around or if he is unable to return the price, what happens then? Did you say?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it does say that she can be redeemed, and so perhaps her family members can pay well, I'm sorry. Never mind. I got that backwards. So it's the husband who's actually paying the money back. So maybe he could pay it to their family members. Again, it's one of those things where these cases, you are going to have different cases like that come up, and the judges are just going to have to use their wisdom and say, okay, what's the principle here? Right? The principle is, we're trying to do right by the girl. We're trying to return her home. So I don't know how they would handle that specifically, but I think the overriding principle is let's protect her and make sure she's taken care of. Okay, Chris?
So I thought I understood this, and now I realize I need clarification.
Okay.
What is the meaning of being redeemed as it keeps coming up?
Yeah,
in
just
Exodus?
bought back, basically bought with a price. Yeah, and so she can be bought back from the husband by the bride price. Yeah, Mary.
What exactly is a sorceress, and why is it just female here?
Oh boy.
Were there no sorcerers?
Well, we only have 10 seconds left to work on. No, I mean, Yeah, it's somebody who's relying on the dark arts. I mean, the Bible presents the demonic realm as a very real realm, and God says, I don't want you being in touch with the dark arts or using, divination or fortune telling, things that connect you to the demonic realm in some way. It might be female because that's just in their culture. It was more likely to be practiced by females, sorcerers. So, yeah, good. Really appreciate it. I know that wasn't the most engaging material, but it's very engaging if you think about God's character. Thank you, guys.
Ryan, can I hand that off to you?
Okay, nice. Well, it kind of forces you to.